Good evening, all, and thank you for joining us tonight. I am Noelle Norton, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of San Diego. Welcome to our latest Illume Speaker Series lecture hosted by the USD Humanities Center. I'm sitting in for the Humanities Center Director, Dr. Brian Clack, who's on sabbatical this year, so I get to do the wonderful intro to the intros. So tonight, we are deeply honored to host Noam Chomsky as our Spring 2021 Knapp Chair of the Liberal Arts. We are truly delighted to bring such a renowned scholar and one of the world's greatest minds to USD, a thinker I have read carefully since I became a political scientist long ago. Although we cannot be in person, we will be speaking virtually with Dr. Chomsky as he illuminates the role of the liberal arts in helping us to confront humanity's urgent 21st century challenges. I'm turning tonight's program over to Dr. Jesse Mills. He's an associate professor in our Department of Ethnic Studies. And Dr. Mills also serves as the Humanities Center Element Chair of Collaborative Research, and he coordinates the Knapp Chair of the Liberal Arts Program for us. So Dr. Mills will begin by introducing our guest speaker and our interlocutor, Dr. Tom Reifer from Sociology.
Thank you so much, Dean Norton. It's a great honor to be here to help kick this event off. Again, I'm Jesse Mills in the Ethnic Studies Department, and thank you for that intro of some of the hats that I wear, Dean Norton. I'm tuning in from the unceded ancestral territory of the Kumeyaay Nation called the San Diego-Tijuana border region, and I want to acknowledge that our well-being depends on decolonization, and that means giving the land back. So tonight, it's an honor to welcome Dr. Noam Chomsky. This Knapp lecture is supported by a generous endowment from the estate of Mary and Churchill Knapp of La Jolla, California, longtime supporters of the College of Arts and Sciences at USD. The Knapp Chair of Liberal Arts Program brings world-class scholars to campus to engage students, staff, faculty, and our community. I have the honor of introducing this conversation on language, the liberal arts, and the challenges of the 21st century with Dr. Chomsky and USD's own Dr. Thomas Reifer. Dr. Reifer is a professor of sociology and affiliated faculty in ethnic studies, Latin American studies, women and gender studies, and the Kroc School of Peace Studies. He's also an associate fellow at the Transnational Institute, a worldwide fellowship of committed scholar activists. Dr. Reifer's areas of interest are many and include evolution of the universe and life, comparative settler colonialisms, imperialism, militarism, immigration, global systemic inequalities, international human rights, and human flourishing, among other areas. Dr. Noam Chomsky is currently laureate professor in the Department of Linguistics in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, the Agnese Nelms Haury Chair in the Agnese Nelms Haury Program in Environmental and Social Justice at the University of Arizona, and Institute Professor and Professor of Linguistics and Philosophy Emeritus in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy at MIT. So thank you to every one of you who've joined in, have tuned in to join us, and please join me in welcoming our Knapp lecturer, Dr. Noam Chomsky.
Noam, good to see you.
Yes, I did.
I want to start off by saying I couldn't help but relate this quote that comes to mind, which is actually a quote that Bakunin said about his friend and colleague and sometimes rival who he criticized, Karl Marx. So Bakunin said, "Few people have read as much and as intelligently as Marx." And when I think of Noam, I think few people have read as much and read as intelligently and written as much and written as intelligently as Noam Chomsky, from whom I've learned a lot. So I wanted to start off by asking you, Noam, specifically about your work starting on language, and in particular going back to your early work, but especially your Cartesian linguistics, a chapter in the history of rationalist thought. And I see that we have James McGilvray, who wrote a wonderful introduction to the third edition in the audience. And specifically, if you could give people, because there's people here from the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton and working class baristas, if you could give people a little background about what at the time was called the mechanical philosophy, philosophy and science. And Descartes' sharp break with that, specifically around the issue of language and creativity.
I should say that for me, middle career, not early career, I learned, which is significant, nothing was known about this. There was a long, rich history of work on language, what was called rational and general grammar. Rational because it tried to give explanations, general because they hoped it would hold for all languages. The tradition reached sort of into the early 20th century, maybe Otto Jespersen, great Danish linguist, was the last representative, then totally forgotten. By the time I was a student in the late 40s, no one had ever heard of it. And I didn't discover it myself until by accident some years later, then became interested. Well, going back to this, the mechanical philosophy, of course, at the time meant science. So mechanical philosophy, mechanical science was the doctrine that was developed at the outset of the modern scientific revolution by Galileo and his contemporaries on through Leibniz, Huygens, Newton, Descartes. That was the tradition. The basic idea was that the world is a complex machine, a much more complex version of the kind of devices that skilled artisans were then creating and all over Europe, exciting great enthusiasm, much as people are enthusiastic about computers today, often with about as much reason. But anyway, very excited that you could walk through the gardens of Versailles and people would talk, voices would talk to you, and fountain would spout, and people would act out, artifacts would act out plays and so on. And the idea was, well, that's essentially the world created by a much more skilled artisan, but essentially a mechanical object. The criterion for intelligibility of a theory for Galileo and his successors was that it could be formulated in mechanical terms, where mechanical means gears and levers, things pushing and pulling each other and so on. That Descartes thought that his great work was to try to show that in fact you could account for everything in the world in these terms. That's his basic scientific work. But he recognized that there is something that doesn't fall within it. The normal use of language, what is sometimes called the creative use of language. The fact that we can effortlessly, every normal person can construct infinitely many thoughts expressed in language, can use them in ways that are, in Cartesian terms, relevant to situations, but not compelled by them, appropriate, but not compelled. You can freely innovate, you can make up new thoughts, you can express them independently of what the circumstances are. And he argued with some plausibility, great plausibility as it turned out, that a machine could never do this. So therefore, that's one of the major bases for his establishing what was called a second substance, res cogitans, a thinking substance, alongside of res extensa, the extended substance, the mechanical world. In modern philosophy, Gilbert Ryle, others, that's sometimes ridiculed as the ghost in the machine, and we have to get rid of the ghost in the machine. Well, what happened was a little bit different. Isaac Newton in Principia demonstrated that Descartes' mechanical system doesn't work, but furthermore, that no mechanical system can work. There are no machines in the sense of the intelligible conceptions of early modern philosophy. The fundamental issue was interaction without contact, action at a distance, and attraction and repulsion. The neo-scholastics accounted for this in terms of what they called sympathies and antipathies. Some things have sympathies, so they come together. Other things have antipathies, they fall apart. That was ridiculed by Galileo, contemporaries. We want to get rid of this nonsense and create a real authentic science. Well, Newton showed that's impossible. Newton regarded the conclusion as an utter absurdity, which no person with any scientific intelligence could possibly accept. Leibniz agreed, Huygens agreed, other great figures of science, yes, recognized and in fact condemned Newton for trying to revert to the what were called occult properties of the despised neo-scholastic tradition. And Newton didn't disagree. He said, yes, he says, I have no physical explanation of this. In fact, his famous comment, I make no hypotheses, is in this context. He can make no hypotheses about what this may mean. He just had a mathematical theory. Historians of science, Tom Kuhn for one, have argued that he called his great work mathematical principles, not philosophy, which would mean science, because he knew he had no explanation for what he was postulating. But he argued that his assumptions were different from those of the neo-scholastics because his occult properties at least had a precise formulation from which you could draw conclusions about the empirical world. They want just pure hand waving. Well, that's how things stood in Newton's day. In fact, it was considered so exotic that his own university, Cambridge, didn't teach any of this for, I think, about 50 years, because it was just so utterly absurd. And in fact, Newton spent the rest of his life trying to find some way something that might mediate action without contact. Failed. And finally, it just became scientific common sense. The goals of science were lowered. Instead of trying to find an intelligible universe, scientists became satisfied with intelligible theories of the universe. Newton's theory was intelligible. Leibniz had no problem understanding it. That wasn't the problem. So if we lower our goals in this way, you can proceed with science. The great thinkers of the day understood exactly what was going on. So within a couple of years after the publication of Principia, Newton's great work, John Locke argued, he framed it within his theological framework. We can reinterpret it. But what he said is, just as the incomparable Mr. Newton, I'm virtually paraphrasing, just as the great Mr. Newton has demonstrated that God has assigned to matter properties of which we have no understanding. So it might be that God had superadded to matter the properties of thought. That became known in the history of philosophy as Locke's suggestion, that thought is a property of organized matter. And it was pursued extensively through the 18th century. David Hume, many others, finally culminating in the work of Joseph Priestley, the great scientist, philosopher of the late 19th century, did extensive work trying to show how organized matter could be the vehicle of thought. This lasted for a little while longer. In fact, Charles Darwin, in his early notebooks in the 1830s, asks why we should be more surprised that matter secretes thought than that it has the mystical properties of attraction. We just have to expect both. By then it was pretty much forgotten. And we moved on to, by the late 19th, early 20th century, moved on to structuralist, behaviorist approaches, which totally have rejected all of this. Recently, it's been rediscovered. In the late 20th century, there were a rediscovery, as without awareness of the earlier period, that what is now called the primary thesis of the science of mind is that the mind is a matter of, is a mode in which organized matter, certain organized matter is put together. That was described by Francis Crick as an astonishing hypothesis. Look at contemporary philosophy, it's described as a radical new idea in philosophy of mind and science. Turns out, going back to Ryle, that it wasn't the ghost that was exercised, it was the machine. The ghost remained. Under Locke, it becomes some property of organized matter. After the 18th century work, mostly forgotten, revived now as what's called the thesis of the new biology, that mind is a property of organized matter. If you read the contemporary work, it repeats almost verbatim the work of Joseph Priestley and others in the 18th century. And it's not an astonishing hypothesis, as Locke recognized. It's the immediate consequence of Newton's demonstration that we're not going to find an intelligible world, just intelligible theories. So we now proceed to try to develop an intelligible theory of whatever matter is. About that, we have no idea. It's whatever physicists tell us in their latest paper. That's matter. They don't know. So, for example, there's a recent interesting paper in one of the journals of quantum theory, advanced journals of quantum theory, where half a dozen or so quantum theoreticians are brought together to answer what sounds like a simple question. What's a particle? No agreement. All kind of proposals as to what's a particle, but whatever it is, that's what we're going to call physical. The term physical has just become kind of an honorific, doesn't really point to anything. It's just a name that we use for whatever we more or less understand that can be kind of assimilated to the core natural sciences. That's physical, whatever it turns out to be. And thought and language are just some of the properties that are inherent in certain kinds of organization of matter, whatever matter is. I think that's, in a thumbnail, that's kind of what's happened, skipping lots of things naturally.
I wanted to go back for a minute because you reminded me that was kind of your middle work, of the famous story of you being at the Institute of Advanced Study and meeting Gödel, and whether that, maybe you could tell people that story, and also how that, if it did, influence your famous critique of B.F. Skinner and behaviorism.
Actually, I wrote the article before I went to the Institute. It was while I was still in Cambridge.
Oh, okay.
But, in fact, it was in 1957, same year as syntactic structures. In Cambridge, where I was a student at Harvard, then went on to MIT. That was the center of the new cognitive science that was being developed. George Miller and Jerry Bruner, others in the field of unified science, Luke Teuber later, others. And I was sort of in the middle of that as a grad student and a young instructor. The dogma in Cambridge was radical behaviorism. most largely through the influence of W.V.O. Quine, famous philosopher, very influential figure in this milieu, you know, and there was almost no questioning of it. But there were a few of us, a couple of grad students, who didn't really believe it. 3, in fact. One was Morris Halley, longtime friend and colleague until his death a couple of years ago. We worked together for many years, founded a department at MIT. Linguists would know him very well. The other was Eric Lenneberg, who went on to medical school, went on to found the modern field of biology of language. The 3 of us were grad students at Harvard in the early 50s, and we were a very small group who just were highly skeptical about the orthodoxy and began reading work that was on the index, European work in ethology, Tinbergen, Lawrence, comparative psychologists like William Thorpe, who just didn't accept the behaviorist orthodoxy. Very few. Finally, George Miller, who was very open-minded, got interested, and he was sort of supportive. But and the review came out of those discussions. One of the interesting things that I was able to write about then was a very important paper with a very interesting history. Carl Lashley, famous neuroscientist, was a professor at Harvard, actually. And in 1950, he wrote a very important paper which totally kicked the props out of the whole behaviorist program. Paper on properties of ordinary behavior that just can't possibly be captured within any behaviorist framework. No one knew about it. I learned about it from an art historian, Meyer Shapiro, polymath who knew everything. So he suggested to me, why don't you read this paper? Turned out to be a real eye-opener. There weren't any easy ways to do database search then, but as far as I could determine, or as far as people have figured out now, it was never referred to in the psychological literature, even in his own department. Actually, his own university. He was in the neurology section. But it was read by neurologists, neuroscientists, but not by anyone in the cognitive science, psychology area. That's the origins and the nature of the review. At that time, I should say that work within the core behaviorist tradition was already beginning to seriously question some of what was coming out. There's a very important article by Nancy and Keller Breland. I think it's 1962. They were students of Skinner's, avid believers in radical behaviorism, operant conditioning. They went off into animal training, and they became the trainers of the famous animals who, those of you who are at the right age, know all about Flipper, the dolphin, and so on, my children's age. They were the trainers of these dolphins and other animals. But they discovered something very interesting. They discovered that when they were training animals by behaviorist principles, it worked very well according to what's predicted, following the degree and character of reinforcement up to a certain point. And at that point, it stopped, and the animals started to regress. So, for example, they described the case of a pig that they were training for a kind of a circus act. The pig would pick up a coin from the ground and was trained to put it into a slot, and a pellet would come out of the slot, and pig would eat it and be happy, you know. So that was the game. So it worked for a while, but they discovered that after a certain point, the pigs started rooting at the coin, digging away at the coin. Instead of picking it up, it started digging there. And of course, it didn't get reinforced. So it got hungry, and then it dug more. It would have starved to death. So what was happening? And then they began reinvestigating the other famous experiments, like pigeons playing ping pong and so on. And what they discovered was that the trainers and the experimenters were taking the instinctive behavior of the animal and slightly modifying it.
Mm.
But after a while, what they called instinctual drift took over.
Mm.
The instincts of the animal took over. Pigs root for things in the ground.
Mm.
So from the pig's point of view, the coin in the ground was just something else to root for. From the pigeon's point of view, it's something else to peck at, you know. But so basically nothing was happening except modifying the fundamental instincts of the animal. And then after a while, the instincts took over and the experiment collapsed. But when they looked over the experimental literature, they found that the experiments usually stopped at the point where this was beginning to happen. That was a pretty serious undermining of the behavior system. I don't think many people paid attention to it, but it was pretty serious, and it was coming from right at the heart of the Skinnerian establishment, his main students, in fact. And other things were beginning to happen at about the same time, sometimes questioning whether reinforcement even takes place. What's left of it all, I think, is very useful techniques for training animals to do things like, say, training pigeons to detect minuscule quantities of some drug or some substance. It is a useful, operant conditioning is a useful measure. It's also used in therapy for autistic kids and others, whether that's wise or not, I don't know, but the technology is used. But I think it sort of departed from science. It really doesn't contribute actually to scientific understanding. And we could say that about many other things. So I'm sure all of you have read the excited newspaper stories about how you can get, what they say is you can get a computer to write an article. What that means is you can get a battery of supercomputers with endless time, wasting of energy, expense, massive data to find patterns in data and to fill out the patterns. Okay, maybe
That's a
it's
good
useful
segue.
for some purpose. Somebody can think of one, but it tells you absolutely nothing about language and composition. And there's actually an easy proof of this. These systems work just as well for impossible languages as they do for actual languages. In the sciences, that's known as a refutation. If you have a theory that works perfectly well for what doesn't happen, you throw out the theory. Okay, standard refutation in science. But in this domain, all that matters is achieving something that looks exciting in the headlines. Tells you nothing about language. No, I don't want to overgeneralize. A lot of it's very sophisticated engineering and a lot of sophisticated statistics, deep learning techniques, and so on. But you should be very careful about being mesmerized by these tricks. Like the early scientific revolution was mesmerized by the great achievements of the artisans, and lots of people were mesmerized by behaviorist experiments. Today's version is, Silicon Valley, but it's worth to keep a touch of skepticism and think about it.
Yeah, that's a good segue to my next question, because my understanding from you, specifically Cartesian linguistics, is that whereas most people, to the extent they talk about free will, talk about it in terms of, quote, physical action in the world, Descartes rooted free will in the creative use of language. And in fact, Desmond Clark, in his book on Descartes' theory of mind, says, to the extent that human beings have free will, it really has to do with our ability, our linguistic ability. And so I was wondering if you could comment on that, and also two of the problems that have preoccupied in your life and which relate to the question of the liberal arts, what you call Plato's problem and also Orwell's problem. This potential paradox, I think of it, in terms of our ability to be creative, including, and people don't really mention this much about Descartes, Descartes thought the moral sensibility was the most important element to use these wisdom of the sciences for, how we treat others. Then, of course, in the real world, there's the question of what you've called thought control in a democratic society. So could you talk a little bit about Plato's problem and Orwell's problem, also in the context of the idea of a liberal arts education?
Yes, I should mention a small anecdote which has contemporary significance. I did write a book about Plato's problem and Orwell's problem. The publisher who had commissioned the book and given me some small advance insisted that I cut out the part about Orwell's problem. And if I didn't, they would refuse to publish the book. That's now called cancel culture, which is not unusual. So I told them to get lost and found a different publisher.
So in other words, if he proved Orwell's problem, then you couldn't title it right.
Very straightforward. Plato's problem is, I quoted Russell's version of it, how is it possible that we know so much with so little evidence? Orwell's problem, which I made up, is how is it that we know so little with so much evidence? And it goes into propaganda and thought control and so on and so forth. That was too much for the publisher. I should say that's not totally unusual. Orwell's main work on this was also unpublished. Everyone's read Animal Farm. Very few people have read Orwell's introduction to Animal Farm. The introduction wasn't published. No one knows why, but you can guess. The introduction was addressed to the people of England, and it said, this book is a satire about the totalitarian enemy, but you people of England shouldn't feel too self-righteous about it, because I'm virtually quoting him now. He said, in free England, ideas can be suppressed without the use of force. And he went on to give some examples and a few brief explanation of why. He said part of the reason is that the press is owned by wealthy men who have every interest in making sure that certain ideas don't get expressed. And the other, which is more interesting, is just immersion in the mainstream culture. If you've got a good education, you went to Oxford and Cambridge, you come out with an understanding, as he put it, that there are certain things it wouldn't do to say. I think we can go on. It wouldn't even do to think them. Yeah. That's what he called literary censorship in free societies. Well, that as introduction wasn't published. It was found 30 years later in his unpublished papers. So that's Orwell. My minor version was a case of cancel culture, not an unusual case, incidentally. But the 2 points are pretty straightforward. Plato's problem is very real. That is the deep problem of human knowledge and human understanding. By now, in many domains like language, we understand a lot about it. turns out that it's now been shown in very sophisticated experimental work that a 2 or 3 year old child has mastered virtually everything about the language. Now, there's a lot of words they don't know, but all the fundamental languages have been mastered. They can't exhibit the knowledge. You look at a child, it's producing 2 words, sentences, but what's going on in its head turns out is essentially the major properties of the language, including some quite subtle ones. But if you look at the evidence available, which by now has been subjected to careful statistical study, it's extremely meager. It doesn't begin to have any of this evidence. Now that goes all the way back to word meaning. Lilac Lightman, others have shown that a child acquires the meaning of a word, which is very complex and rich if you look at it, from virtually no presentations. A couple of presentations, then the whole richness is in there. We're back to instinctual drift. All of this is fundamentally instinctive. There's something part of our nature is having these basic principles and concepts. There is a serious problem all the way through the modern field of generative grammar. It's been pursuing objectives which seem to be contradictory. One of the objectives is reviving, without knowledge, the tradition of universal grammar, trying to find out what is universal to language, not in the old sense, but in the new sense of what's fixed about the combinatorial procedure that enables us to carry out the Cartesian insight of creating an unbounded number of expressions of thought, using them on appropriate occasions. That's got to be some finite generative procedure. One of the reasons generative grammar could develop in the 20th century is that the great mathematicians of the 1930s and 40s, Turing, Gödel, Church, others, had made very clear how a finite object like the brain or your laptop can, in fact, have unbounded generative capacity. That all became very clear. So it was possible to search for the computational procedures that would have this capacity. That couldn't have been done before. So the questions were raised, but they couldn't really be answered. So one problem is we have this internal generative procedure, but it has to meet 2 apparently contradictory conditions. One is it has to be complex enough so that it can account for the leap from meager data to rich knowledge. Plato's problem has to be rich enough to enable that leap to take place. On the other hand, it has to be simple enough so that it could have evolved under the conditions of human evolution, which we now know are pretty narrow. Turns out there's by now very good evidence, including genomic evidence, that humans began to separate, they were a very small group, began to separate roughly about 150,000 years ago. And they have the same language capacity. So the language capacity was intact at least 150,000 years ago. And as far as we know, it hasn't changed at all since, which is not surprising. This is a brief period of evolutionary time. The other piece of the story is that there's no indication that anything like language existed prior to Homo sapiens. There's no sign of any meaningful symbolic activity or other reason to expect that some creative system was internalized. Well, that's maybe 200,000 or 300,000 years. Now, all of these are a flick of the eye in evolutionary time, almost instantaneously. So we have two conditions. Language, the basic system of language has to be simple enough so that it could have evolved almost instantaneously in evolutionary time, but it must be rich enough so that it can account for Plato's problem. It looks like a contradiction. In the background is lurking another problem, the apparent great variety of languages. How come there's so many languages looking totally different from one another? Well, I think we by now are beginning to get a handle on this. What's called the minimalist program is beginning to show a way in which all of this can be reconciled. I think that's one of the exciting discoveries of the recent period, and to the extent, if you can establish and verify it, I think it'll be the most important discovery in the history of the study of mind and language. And I think we can now begin to see how you could get an answer to that. It's too complicated to go into without a blackboard, but
yeah. Could you talk a little bit about, if you go back to Socrates and Descartes, who seemed to be interested in, and you talked about this a little bit in your course, Language, Mind, and Consciousness, the Delphi Oracle, Know Thyself, and then Socrates' questioning and Descartes' unwillingness to take the existing scholarship as given. And the idea behind the liberal arts tradition, which, by the way, I was reading this book, The Copernican Question, and it starts off with a quote, or it starts off by saying, under what conditions do people change or give up beliefs to which they are most deeply committed? And later, to my surprise, I found that he has a reference to the liberal arts going back to a 16th century German thinker, but it actually goes back to the Greeks. So we have this tradition at the University of liberal arts. The idea behind it, I think, is to allow for this free creativity and questioning. But of course, we find ourselves at this terminal point for the human species about whether we're going to continue on this road to destruction or something else. So could you talk a little bit about the liberal arts and the idea behind the liberal arts and how we unleash it to deal with especially the climate crisis and the question of nuclear weapons that is posing the threat of human extinction today?
Well, the liberal arts are guided, I think, by the injunction of the priestess of the Delphic Oracle. Delphic Oracle she had very simple advice: know thyself. So that's the crucial matter. Know thyself. And the wording of Socrates, it's an unexamined life is not worth living. So examine your life, then build on from there. And I think most of our subsequent intellectual, artistic, aesthetic inquiry is exploring who we are. What kind of creatures are we? What kind of capacities do we have? What kind of limits do we have? What is the nature of what's intrinsic to us and what's modified by external systems? To what extent are we subordinate to what's around us? Could bring in another great philosopher, David Hume, who, among other things, wrote the first modern tract in what's nowadays called political science. His book on the first principles of government, mid-18th century. He opens the book with a paragraph in which says roughly this. He says that he is astonished to see the easiness by which the many are governed by the few. This is a very strange phenomenon. He says power is in the hands of the governed. why do they allow themselves to be subjected to the few? And he says the answer to this mystery must be consent. Somehow the few succeed in imposing consent on the many, and they subject themselves to it, and therefore do not use the power that's in their hands to liberate themselves. We see this all over, everywhere we look. So if some young person, say you're teaching liberal arts and one of your students asks for advice, the best advice that you can give them and the greatest thing you can look forward to is somehow finding a job. Getting a job is the greatest thing in life. What is getting a job? Getting a job is subjecting yourself to the rule of a master for your entire almost your entire waking life. If you look back, study the liberal arts, you look back in history, you find that from classical times up until the late 19th century, this was regarded as an abomination, a fundamental attack on human rights and human dignity is to be subjected to the authority of a master. Having a job. The working class press of the 19th century bitterly denounced this. The idea was so common, it was a slogan of the Republican Party under Abraham Lincoln's Republican Party. It was what they called wage slavery, was they said no different from slavery except insofar as it's temporary. You can subject yourself to a master long enough to become a free person again. Very rich literature about this. The great figures of the Enlightenment, like Wilhelm von Humboldt, one of the founder of the university system and one of the founders of classical liberalism, bitterly condemned the idea that people should be subjected to others. One of the images he used is that if a skilled artisan produces a beautiful work on command, we admire what he does, but we despise what he is, namely a subject to the master's authority. That's what we now consider the highest goal in life.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful, very striking example of what David Hume was talking about. Somehow, the culture is designed so that it imposes consent. Orwell's observation again. Yeah. Antonio Gramsci, in his Mussolini's prison cell, wrote about what he called hegemonic common sense, the things we just take for granted, like the air we breathe, you know. Well, one of the contributions of the liberal arts is to know thyself, to know the long, rich history of condemnation of this conception from classical antiquity, Cicero, right, others, all the way through the 19th century.
Well, it's ironic too, because going back to Socrates and Jesus, the notion that what if one should gain the whole world but lose one's soul? That's there at the heart of it in Socrates' defense and Jesus' sayings too. But we seem to have forgotten that. And it's hard to see anything that could be more losing one's soul than the recent president we have, who was, as you talked about, seemed to be dedicated to destroying the possibilities for organized human life.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last one.
Oh, it would seem to be harder to get closer towards giving up your soul than the last president we had, who seemed to be dedicated to destroying the possibility for organized human life.
For organized human life. Well, we're now at a point where and this should be a fundamental question, not only for liberal arts education, where it's central, but for everyone. I mentioned before that humans have extraordinary capacity, but remarkable limitations, both, and the two are actually related. A capacity to do something carries with it an inability to do something else. If we're capable of running, we're not capable of flying, because the same systems that allow us to run better than anyone else keep us from flying. And I think the same is probably true of cognitive and moral capacities. And we're now facing a dramatic question about that. Will the human experiment persist? That question has to be answered in this generation. There's no time to waste. We're facing crises that have never arisen before in human history. Unless they're dealt with, we can say goodbye to each other. One of them is heating the planet. We are reaching the point where if we proceed on the present course, within a couple of decades, we will have reached tipping points which are irreversible. And then we move on irreversibly to what scientists call a hothouse planet, one in which we'll reach in the not distant future temperatures of 3 to 4 degrees, 4 to 5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, which is far beyond the possibility of organized human life. There are means to answer it, to deal with it. Definite, clear means. Well known, takes maybe 2 to 3% of gross domestic product, but are we capable of doing it? Or are we going to be so committed to institutions that maximize short-term profit and disregard need that we can't escape? The same is true of the other comparable existential problem that we face, nuclear weapons. We've been living under that shadow for 75 years. Anyone who's looked at the record in detail, as you have, knows that it's almost a miracle that we've survived. Case after case where human intervention at the last minute stopped total disaster. Many cases of very reckless attitudes, actions by leaders, others just pure accident. Chances of accident increase as systems become automated, which is now being planned, response systems, and as new weapons are being developed that are more lethal, more impossible to intercept than the ones that exist now, like hypersonic missiles and so on. One of Donald Trump's achievements was to dismantle almost the entire arms control regime. The last piece of it was salvaged literally within hours. It was the New START Treaty was going to terminate on February 5th. Trump had been delaying renewal of it. Russians had been urging renewal. The Trump administration had avoided it, just that they had dismantled every other component of the arms control system. Biden was able to sign it literally within hours of termination. So that one piece remains. It's by no means enough. Well, again, there are answers. In fact, the treaty just went into force a couple of weeks ago, United Nations Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. They are now illegal under international law. Of course, the nuclear weapon states refuse to abide by that. Unless they are compelled to do so, chances of survival are very slight. Well, these are two enormous problems. No delay. They have to be answered quickly. And we are now facing the question, are humans capable of doing what can be done, what's within reach, to move on to a much better life?
In that context,
I don't know. The answer to that question is in the hands of the current generation, not a pleasant.
In that context, one
that can't be avoided.
In that context, one of the things that Trump was very successful at doing is opening up the Pandora's box of all the racisms and sexisms and hatreds in American history. And we saw that recently in the massacre of predominantly Asian women in Atlanta. Could you talk about the role of racism and sexism and xenophobia in preventing us from creating a better world, and the importance of
The role of who?
racism and sexism? Racism and sexism.
Necessity?
Oh, sorry. Racism and
Maybe.
sexism. R-A-C-I-S-M.
R.
Let me write it in the chat.
E-T-I-S.
Oh, I don't know if my mic is working here. I was saying racism
Not
and
working.
sexism. No?
Could you hear?
Racism.
Racism.
And
Ah,
sexism.
that's for us, no joke. Not just us.
Yeah, thanks, Larry.
The problem of racism is dramatic in the United States, but anyone who thinks it's different in Europe is wrong. Europe is probably more racist than the United States. It hasn't shown up as clearly in Europe because the societies are more homogeneous. But as soon as there's the slightest change, it goes wild. You get a tiny percentage of people in Denmark who aren't blue-eyed and blonde-haired. The country blows up. You know, it's very serious. White supremacy in the United States is a deep pathology. We just saw an exhibition of it on January 6th. Wasn't the only factor, but it was one major one. Is it ineradicable? One of those other things we don't know. If it is ineradicable, we're basically finished. No society can survive on a principle of ethnic, race, religious superiority over others. It's happening all over the world. Take India. Indian secular democracy is being destroyed by Narendra Modi's Hindu nationalist extremism, which is imposing a religious Hindu ethnocracy, which is literally destroying 70 years of democratic revolution, secular democracy. It's happening in Europe with the so-called illiberal democracies. We're seeing it a couple of miles from where I live, not far from the Tucson, Arizona, not far from the US-Mexican border, a couple of miles south of where I live. Poor, desperate people are dying in the harsh desert environment to which they are driven originally by Bill Clinton's militarization of the border, which was designed to drive fleeing people, fleeing away from the places where there's easy access for asylum, like San Diego, and off into the impassable desert where they can die of starvation or thirst. And there are, where I live, there are in Tucson, there are groups, religious groups, others, with people, volunteers who go out into the desert to try to leave bottles of water if people can find them, to try to set up small camps where they can provide minimal, absolutely minimal care for people who manage to get into them. They're attacked by the Border Patrol, by the shock forces of the Border Patrol, those who were sent to Portland recently to terrorize Portland. When Trump decided to terrorize the city, he couldn't send the military because they refused to go. So he sent paramilitary shock forces, including the shock forces of the Border Patrol, who were trained to just that people are valueless. You can do anything to them you want. And this is happening a couple of miles from where we live. Why are these people fleeing? They don't want to live in the United States. Yeah. They're fleeing because conditions where they live are impossible. and we have played a large role in making them impossible. Reagan's terrorist wars, people are still fleeing from the areas that were subjected to virtual genocide, continuing on to the present.
I assume you probably heard about.
Thing that one can say about it is that Europe is worse. Europe is even more vicious and savage in trying to keep people fleeing from misery away from its holy shores. Thousands of people are dying in the Mediterranean. Europe won't either shoot, it'll sink the ships or send them back to misery. They're fleeing from Africa. Europe has emplacements deep in Africa to try to, in Niger, other very poor countries, there to prevent immigrants from fleeing so that they can somehow save themselves from the wreckage of Africa. Why is Africa wrecked? Well, a couple of centuries of history tell us something about that. European history, okay? Don't have to review it. The European,
I assume you heard about the, sorry, I assume you heard about the recent death of Sister Diana Ortiz. I said, I assume you heard about the recent death of Sister Diana Ortiz.
Diana Ortiz?
Yeah.
Who was tortured, an American nun who was tortured under supervision of US military authorities in Guatemala. She died recently.
Yeah, and yet there's still almost no discussion. There's almost no discussion in the news media about the border crisis, about the US role in Central America or our responsibility for this.
It's one of those things, to quote Orwell, it wouldn't do to say.
Right.
We can concern ourselves deeply with things we can do nothing about. So right now, there's a lot of concern about the fate of the Uyghurs in China, okay? Perfect topic, we can do absolutely nothing about it. So therefore we can stand on a pedestal, talk about how noble we are, criticize them for what they're doing. Now, what about things we can do a lot about? Not far from the border, for example, or take, say, Gaza. There are 2 million people in Gaza facing virtual destruction. Place will be, it's under imprisonment, it's imprisoned, it's constantly attacked. People are on what Israel calls a diet, just barely enough to survive while the place disappears. UN regards it as by now approaching conditions of unlivability. We are directly responsible for that. We can do a great deal about it. So therefore, it's better not to say. Because if you say, we have to do something about it. Let's say a lot about things we can do nothing about. The other fellow's crimes. The other fellow's crimes we can get very irate about and talk about how wonderful we are on our pedestals. Our own, better not talk about them. Leave it to somebody else. People who do talk about them are condemned as what McGeorge Bundy called wild men in the wings. People who question our nobility and our exceptionalism and our marvelous commitments. We don't want those people around. They're traditionally subjected to cancel culture, though it's not called that. But it's a free country, so they're not sent to the gulag. They're not tortured.
Well, as a former runaway street kid, I was always very impressed with your piece, The Responsibility of Intellectuals, and equally impressed with the chapter by our friend who's turning 90 on April 7th, Dan Ellsberg, The Responsibility of Officials in a Criminal War. And I've often thought about the question of the responsibility of adults. So if you were to take your responsibility of intellectuals and to talk about it in the responsibility of adults.
Well, I borrowed the term responsibility of intellectuals from great writer Dwight MacDonald, His articles in the 1940s were what I grew up with. He was one of those wild men in the wings who was raising all sorts of questions about things you're not supposed to talk about. One of the things he talked about was responsibility of peoples and responsibility of intellectuals. So who are intellectuals? Not necessarily people who are smarter than anyone else, not even people who are more educated than anyone else, people who are more privileged, people like us. We're very privileged. And we have the ability, like you and I, you look at what's behind us, lots of books. We are privileged to be able to accumulate lots of books, time to read them, to think about them. We're able to talk to students, speak in public, have a variety of privileges. So we have a lot more responsibility. Privilege confers responsibility. That's automatic. We can do things that others can't do. So what's the responsibility? To satisfy minimal, elementary human values, beginning with knowing thyself, going on to finding out the truth about it, trying to help others understand it, to deal with the problems that we have the privilege to research and investigate, like why people are dying in the desert a couple of miles from where I live, similar ones elsewhere. We can do that, and our minimal responsibility is to undertake an effort to do something about it. That's one version of responsibility of intellectuals. There's another version of responsibility of intellectuals. It was stated rather clearly by Henry Kissinger, who's a master in the art, said the responsibility of the intellectual, he means the intellectual concerned with politics, is to articulate the views of those with power, to present the views of those with power, and to present them in a way which such that they can be implemented, sometimes called stenographers of power. That's the responsibility of intellectuals. And the responsible intellectuals are those who undertake that distinction that goes way back in history. I don't want to go way back, but well, we can go back to Socrates again. Who was it who drank the hemlock in classical Athens? It was the guy who was corrupting the youth of Athens by getting them to think about things and to ask questions. We don't want him around, not in free Athens. So yes, he drank the hemlock. The people who repeated, didn't corrupt the youth, didn't ask questions, just said, believe what the powerful say, they're fine. We don't want to bother them. Goes all the way to the modern times. The term intellectual in its modern sense was not really used before the late 19th century. Comes along with the Dreyfus Arts, the people who defended Dreyfus from the false charges against him. Emile Zola, other Dreyfus Arts. Today, we honor them, not at the time.
Yes. They
were harshly, bitterly condemned. Emile Zola had to flee France for his life. The immortals of the French Academy, the great leading intellectuals, denounced these writers and artists. What right do they have to do to criticize our great institutions, the state and the army? What do they know, these writers? They should shut up and keep to their business.
This goes back to Aristophanes' The Clouds, where Socrates is seen as a corrupter of the young. And actually, Aristophanes, he said something else, which is that he talked about the origins of industries involved in peace and those involved in war, go back to ancient Greece. Could you talk a little bit about the military corporate complex?
The
military corporate complex?
Military corporate complex.
Yeah, and its role both in the Cold War and today. There's a lot of illusions about it and a lack of recognition that it even exists.
I mean, it's there. This is Eisenhower's famous military-industrial complex, which, as Dan Ellsberg, our common friend, pointed out, in Eisenhower's original version of his speech, it was the military-industrial congressional complex. He cut out congressional on the advice of his speechwriters to be less confrontational. But yes, it's the military-industrial congressional complex, which is designed to maintain a massive military machine. What is that massive military machine for? Well, if you look at international relations theory, take the realist version of international relations theory, the dominant version, states pursue what is called the national interest. And the military machine, at least in principle, is supposed to be pursuing the national interest. Many realist analysts harshly criticize it because they say it's being used in ways which don't support the national interest. But are states concerned with the national interest? Well, what's the evidence for that? The national interest is supposed to be the interests of the nation. Do states act in the interests of the nation? Well, if you look through it carefully, you see that they don't. They act in the interests of powerful groups which dominate the state. This is not a new insight. We can go back to David Hume's close friend, Adam Smith, something else you can read in a liberal arts, study in a liberal arts education. 1776, interesting year. Adam Smith published his Wealth of Nations, and he described, he was interested in England, of course, the main democratic society of the day. He said in England, the merchants and manufacturers of England, he said, are the masters of mankind. They are the principal architects of government policy, and they make sure that their own interests are well attended to, however grievous the impact on others, including the people of England, and particularly those who he described as the victims of the savage injustice of the Europeans. I don't think we have much trouble translating that into modern terms. So yes, it's worth reading the classics, actually reading them, seeing what they say, why they say it. We can actually go on. A couple of years after 1776, the United States won its freedom, went on to produce the Constitution, Holy Writ today. The main framer of the Constitution was James Madison. His major concern in the Constitution was to prevent democracy. Very explicit about it. In fact, the main scholarly work on the Constitutional Convention, kind of gold standard in the field today, is Michael Klarman's, Harvard professor's book called The Framers' Coup, a coup against democracy. They were very concerned that the unwashed masses, the general public, would become too much involved in affairs of state, which are none of their business. Their business is to observe on the outside. They can pick one of the responsible people once in a while, called an election, but beyond that, they should keep quiet. We deal with it. Madison set up the Senate, an unelected body picked by the elite, as the main center of power, because he said the Senate represents the wealth of the nation, the responsible class of men. They're the ones who should govern, because they have an understanding of the rights of property. And the goal of government must be to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. Well, that's the Constitution. And it was, of course, written by a small group of wealthy men, mostly slave owners. Nobody else could get to Philadelphia in those days and spend a couple of months talking to each other. The Madison, in his defense, was pre-capitalist. He assumed that the wealthy men, the responsible men, would be the Roman gentlemen of the imagination of the time, you know, devoted to selfless gentlemen, devoted to the common good. He soon learned otherwise. In 1792, something else you can read if you have a liberal education, 1792, Madison wrote a letter to his friend Jefferson, bemoaning the fact that the experiment he designed was collapsing because, as he said, the stock jobbers, in our day that means Wall Street, the stock jobbers, he said, are becoming the tools and tyrants of government, overwhelming it by their combinations, benefiting from its largesse. Can we translate that into 2020? Without much trouble.
Yes.
Well, there are things that are worth knowing about our past, about who we are, going back to the priestess at Delphi, what kind of creatures we are, and how we can deal with the world around us, the world that will be destroyed for humans and millions of other species if we continue on our present course.
I know we're coming to an end, but I think we might have a little bit of time if I can impose for questions. So I think Lindy's going to open the chat here.
Couldn't hear that, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I think we might have a little bit of time for questions.
Oh, okay.
So please put them in the chat room if you have them.
Okay.
And I will communicate them.
If they'll be in the chat room, that means I can read them.
Oh, okay.
Which will help given my disabilities. One of my disabilities is a dog who's trying to keep my hand from the...
Okay, I think I can, well, it's a very long one, but I'll try to maybe summarize it.
Down, Gus. It's one of the disadvantages.
Oh, actually,
well,
this might be helpful because so one of the things that you've talked about is classical liberalism. And of course, today, people get very confused about the term liberal versus classical liberalism. So in fact, when Trump was asked about this, he had a very odd reply. So maybe you could tell people a little bit about the fundamental difference between the notion of classical liberalism and the language that we use today on both liberal and conservative.
Well, classical liberals were people like those I quoted, Wilhelm von Humboldt, Abraham Lincoln, people who believed that any interference with a person's freedom is illegitimate unless somehow you can provide a justification for it. So in particular, as I quoted, I'll quote Humboldt again, any infringement on a person's personal freedom cannot be defended, whether it's from the state or a landowner. That, in his day, meant the person with private capital, which is all land in the 18th century. He said that's all illegitimate. He said the peasant who tills the soil is more an owner of the crop than the rich landowner who sits in his mansion and allows him to use the land. I said, again, if we quote again what I said before, if an artisan produces a beautiful object on command, we admire what he did, we despise what he is, a tool in the hands of others. Go to Abraham Lincoln. What he called wage slavery is no different from chattel slavery, except that it's temporary until you can become a free person again. That's classical liberalism, not exactly contemporary liberalism. John Stuart Mill, one of the great classical liberals of the 19th century, famous classical liberal, took as the epigraph for his great work on liberty a quote from Humboldt, which is approximately of the kind that I said, a slightly different one. Mill himself argued that if human society progresses further, it will lead to a mode of free association among working people controlling their workplaces. He was writing in the midst of the early Industrial Revolution, not pre-capitalist like Smith and Humboldt. Well, that's classical liberalism. You know what modern liberalism is it actually has two meanings. In England, it means something like remotely like classical liberalism, not much, but at least remotely. In the United States, it means something like mild social democracy. In the terms of, almost like most terms of political discourse, they've almost lost their meaning.
Could you talk a little bit about the way in which some modern notions of rights have been hijacked, for example, with Citizens United, or even more recently, we have about 170 Republicans voting against the Violence Against Women Act, supposedly because they don't want people who've been involved in domestic abuse to get weapons, even though there's a lot of evidence that makes them.
Referring to the Equal Rights Amendment, which was actually voted down. And rather strikingly, a large number of women voted against it. Trapped, in my view, deluded, but you can have your own interpretation, but under the influence of Phyllis Schlafly's movement, which claimed that to give women equals rights would be an attack on the family, on raising of children, on women, what women actually really want to do and sort of are destined to do. A lot of people bought that, including a lot of women. We don't have an Equal Rights Amendment.
Actually, I was talking about the more recent vote in the House against the Violence Against Women Act.
Against the Violence Against Women Act.
Yeah.
Sort of the same. I think the reasoning is pretty much the same. We don't want to attack the fundamental institution of the family, nurturing of children, patriarchal families, and so on. This is called conservatism for a very strange reason. In fact, if you look at it, it has a pretty strange history. So take the Republicans now are a party that is dedicated to terminating abortion rights, cutting them down to the very limit, maybe eliminating them altogether. Where did that come from? That's interesting to look at. If you go back to the 1960s, the leading figures in the Republican Party were strongly pro-choice, including Ronald Reagan, who was the governor of California then, passed one of the strongest pro-choice, the term wasn't used then, but what we now call pro-choice measures anywhere. George H.W. Bush, strongly pro-choice. Barry Goldwater, also on so-called libertarian grounds. Something happened. What happened was that in around 1975, the leading Republican strategist, Paul Weyrich, got a flash of light. He realized that if the Republicans pretended, I stress pretended, to be pro-anti-choice, anti-abortion, they could pick up the vote of the evangelical Christians. It's about 25% of the population, and of Northern Catholics who were voting Democratic. Flipped on a dime. They all suddenly became passionately opposed to abortion rights. Well, you can ask what was going on in their minds, but they got the idea. It's kind of like Nixon's Southern strategy a couple of years earlier. If we pretend to oppose civil rights, we can pick up the Southern vote. Okay. Same with gun rights, incidentally. What does gun rights have to do with conservatism? Absolutely nothing. The Constitution says nothing about it. The Constitution says, yeah, it was an agricultural country. People have a right to their musket to chase critters away. It does say to establish, in order to guarantee a well-regulated militia, you can have gun rights. Where did the hysteria about gun rights come from? Well, that's an interesting story too. Comes from the first major triumph of the nascent public relations industry in the late 19th century. After the Civil War, the fancy gun manufacturers, Remington, Winchester, Colt, and so on, didn't have a market. Civil War provided them with a huge market. Wars in Europe were winding down. They were losing the European market. It was an agricultural country. Every farmer had a gun, but as I said, all they wanted was some old musket. They didn't chase the coyotes away. They didn't want the fancy stuff the gun manufacturers were producing. Well, what do you do when you don't have a market? You create one by advertising. And a huge advertising campaign was developed, which created a totally fake image of the Wild West, sheriffs fast on the draw, cowboys riding to the rescue, all the stuff I grew up on a kid, Wyatt Earp, all that's, I believed it all when I was 10 years old. That was just instituted as part of the culture. Nothing to it. There was no Wild West. Cowboys were considered kind of the lowest of the low. If you couldn't get another job, you maybe get a job pushing cows around, but all totally fabricated. But now it's part of the culture here. It's part of the culture in Europe. And there was a subtext after talking about the wonders of the Wild West and the great sheriffs. There's a line that says, your son won't be a real man unless he has a Winchester rifle. And your daughter won't be a real woman unless she has a pretty little pink revolver that she can pull out, Okay, that became the culture. And it became a matter of fanaticism. In 2008, the Supreme Court changed Scalia's decision, and the Supreme Court changed a century of precedent and said having a gun is an individual right. A very interesting decision if you read it, very striking. It's what's called originalist, textualist. That's the dominant ideology. You're supposed to take the text of the Holy Writ, not consider what the people had in mind, what they meant by it. No, that's not permitted. Just take the text of the Holy Writ and see how somebody might have interpreted it if they gave it a little reading in the 18th century. In my view, that's clinically insane to run a country that way, but you can make your own decision. That's textualism. So his very learned decision avoided one fundamental question. Why did the framers have the Second Amendment? Well, we know the answer. You're not allowed to look because that's not textualism. But we know the answer. The one reason is they thought the British were coming. They mentioned a militia because the US had no standing army. And the British were the dangerous force then. In fact, they came in 1812. So we had to have the Minutemen around, able to get together quickly in a militia and to chase the British away. That was one reason. Second reason was it was a slave society. Slave owners needed guns. In places like South Carolina, slaves outnumbered whites. Slave owners, there were slave rebellions going on all over the Caribbean. Slave owners needed guns to keep the slaves down. Second reason for the Second Amendment. Third reason was the main reason for the American Revolution. In 1763, King George III issued a royal proclamation saying that the colonists were not allowed to move beyond the Appalachian Mountains. That was Indian country. The Indian nations were protected by the crown. Colonists weren't having any of that. They wanted to invade Indian nations. That included the great land speculators like George Washington, who didn't want to be cut off from lucrative investments in Indian territory. As soon as the revolution succeeded, that edict was over, the colonists could go on to invade Indian nations, exterminate the population, drive them away. First, you needed guns for that. Secondly, you needed the cavalry to take over when the militias didn't. First, it was militias, like the Tennessee, Kentucky militia. And then it was the cavalry who could come in and finish off the job. Lasted right through the 19th century. California was the last part where it was literal genocide in the latter part of the 19th century. The United States is one of those unusual countries that's been at war, aggressive war, almost every day since its founding. Try to find a year when we were not involved in war, usually aggressive. Conquered half of Mexico. That's why I'm in the United States, not in Mexico. So yes, you needed guns. That's why you had us. Does any of this apply to the 20th century? I mean, the Second Amendment's irrelevant to the 20th century.
By the way,
no British, no slaves, no more territory to conquer. Of course, there's an empire, but that's not what the Second Amendment's for. So it has no bearing on the 20th century altogether. But if you ask the population in the United States what's in the Constitution, the first thing they'll tell you is the Second Amendment. That's the chief element of the Constitution. It's another interesting way in which consent is imposed by the powerful. These are things that are worth thinking about. They permeate our whole culture, our whole understanding. You have to think about them. Decide what conclusions you want, but at least think about them. Don't keep them under the rug. That's what a liberal arts education ought to be about.
One more question I want to ask you before you go.
Okay.
About Pope Francis, his speech to Congress. Pope Francis, in addition to calling in Congress for the abolition of the arms trade, talked about his four heroes, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Thomas Merton, and Dorothy Day. Dorothy Day was the founder of the anarchist Catholic Worker. And I thought it was pretty amazing that one of the oldest patriarchal institutions of the world talked about Dorothy Day, an anarchist.
Dorothy,
yeah,
amazing person. I was lucky enough to be able to meet her at the Catholic Worker Center in New York, where she was still running the center. She was quite old then. She was an astonishing person. You should look up her biography, long, complicated story, but she ended up as a religious pacifist anarchist, very dedicated, very committed to pacifist anarchist traditions, a religious pacifist anarchist. That's worth thinking about. When you think about the so-called religious divide in the United States, strong tendency is to think of the religious as the reactionaries, the gun lovers, the Trump lovers, the racists, the white supremacists. Well, That's part of religion. There's another part that has a very interesting history and that we have a large role in. Dorothy Day was the inheritor of a tradition that goes back to the Gospels. The Gospels is a radical pacifist document. And in the first couple of centuries of Christianity, those who upheld the Gospels were persecuted, harshly persecuted. That changed in the 4th century. In the 4th century, 315, the Emperor Constantine adopted the church. Wasn't called Catholicism then, we call it Catholicism now, adopted the church as the official religion of the Roman Empire. The shields of the Roman soldiers had the cross on them. The great historian of Christianity, Hans Küng, in his History of Christianity, writes that at that point, the church changed from being the church of the persecuted to the church of the persecutors. And it pretty much remained that way through centuries of pretty ugly and violent history, up until 1962, when Pope John the 23rd called Vatican II. I'm cutting out a lot of complexity, of course, but this is, I think, the general picture. 1962, Pope John called Vatican II to rethink the role of the church in the world in many ways. Part of it was to reinstitute into church teaching the Gospels. Okay, let's not just recite the words in Latin, which we don't understand. Let's look at the actual meaning of the text, the radical pacifist Gospels, which are devoted to what was called the preferential option for the poor. That was picked up by Latin American bishops who, in their own conferences, said, yes, we will advocate the preferential option for the poor. Bishops, nuns, lay people went to poor communities in areas under deep persecution with the United States behind it for centuries, for over a century, bitterly persecuted, went to communities, tried to encourage them to read the Gospels, called base communities, think about what they say, try to organize to pursue the preferential option for the poor, take your fate into your own hands, and try to get viable communities free from oppression and violence. Well, the United States reacted to that. It went to war against the church. From 1962, the United States has been at war against the Catholic Church, and it's proud of it. It takes pride in having defeated the church. If you go to the famous School of the Americas, it's changed its name recently because of bad publicity, but it's the same place. The School of the Americas, which trained Latin American killers, was its main duty. They have what they call talking points, advertising the great things they've done. One of them is the US Army helped defeat liberation theology. What's liberation theology? It's the preferential option for the poor. It's the Gospels. It was what's being preached by Pope John 23rd. Vatican later regressed. What was preached by that's one reason there are so many religious martyrs in Latin America. The whole stream of religious martyrs, including the Archbishop of El Salvador, Archbishop Romero, who was actually picked to be Archbishop because he was quite conservative.
Yeah.
But he was a decent human being. He became upset by the killing of his own parish priests by right-wing forces armed by the US, by the killing of civilians. He was assassinated while reading Mass by forces allied with the United States. That opened the decade of the 80s, a vicious, violent decade of massacre in Central America, Reagan's wars. The decade ended in 1989 with the assassination of 6 leading Latin American intellectuals, Jesuit priests, by an elite force armed, trained by the United States. They were assassinated on the direct orders of the Central Command, close contact with the US Embassy. One of the reasons for the flight of refugees, which is still continuing right at the border where I live. Acts have consequences, okay? I should say that during the 80s, in the United States, a popular movement developed which had absolutely no precedent in the history of imperialism. For the first time in the history of imperialism, people from the aggressor country, the United States, not only protested the violence and atrocities, but went to live with the victims, to help them, to protect them, to give what protection a white face would give. They were protecting the people under attack by US-run terrorist forces. That has never happened before. Nobody thought of going to a Vietnamese village to protect people from the forces armed by the United States or US soldiers. Nobody in France thought of going to an Algerian visit. Who were these people? Very large number of them were Christians, Christian evangelicals. I remember talking in Christian churches, in evangelical churches in the Midwest and rural Maryland, other places where people knew more about Latin America than in the universities because they were living there. They had people living and working there. Well, that's another side to religion. Dorothy Day was an example of that. Things can cut in a lot of different ways.
We have to end it here, but I want to thank Noam and the University of San Diego. And moreover, I want to urge everybody to read Noam's books and all the books he's read and cites and help create the world that will be livable and flourishing for all the people and all the living things in the world. Noam is one of the great bodhisattvas of our time. And I personally am very indebted to him for a lifetime of learning. And I think that also the movements that he and others have involved in, not only do they work to create a better world, but they help to change people's lives. They changed my life as a runaway street kid. I got involved in the nuclear weapons freeze because I met my sister, Jane, who was involved in the movement, and that's why I'm here today. So get involved with different organizations like the Freedom Riders Foundation and others. They're doing wonderful work, and let's keep this wonderful thing called life going and make it decent and livable for all human beings and sentient beings. Thank you, Noam. Very, very appreciative.
Appreciated it very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chomsky. It was brilliant.
Thank you very much.